Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Es woll und Gott genädig sein, which translates to May God be gracious to us. We've taken a look at this text in the past a couple of times. This is a brand new harmonization, and it is quite the harmonization. There's a lot going on in this chorale. It is very dense, lots of subdivisions. It's going to be quite difficult to read on the page. I'm going to try and make it as legible as I can, but hopefully talking through it will be the majority of the content that you're able to gather from this video. But like I said, I'm going to try and make it as legible as possible. Let's hop into the analysis. So, no key signature. We start with E major, and interestingly, we end on E major, so I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is A minor, and we're starting on the dominant E major. A, E, A, and C is A minor in root position. That's our tonic triad. C and E are both chord tones. Then we have A, D, F, and B. Kind of an interesting chord here. This is B minor 7 flat 5 in third inversion. And get this, we have a minor dominant. It is resolving to a minor dominant G, E, E, and B. So it's resolving where we expect it to, down by step, and to a chord that's in first inversion, but we typically expect major dominance, just like how we start the chorale with. We would expect an E major chord in a minor key. Here we're seeing a minor chord. It's pretty cool to see Bach use a minor dominant here, and that takes us to F, A, E, and A. I reckon this E is an accented non-chord tone, or I guess a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and this is actually 4/6, D diminished over F. And then we have, D diminished, D minor over F. And then we have F, G, G, and B, which is an incomplete G7 chord. That would be 5, 4, 2. In the key of A minor, that is not 5, 4, 2. That is 7, 4, 2. And that takes us to, we would expect C major in first inversion. That's exactly where we go to. E, G, G, and C. And I'm already going to use my first arrow here. 3, 6, C major over E. We expect the root to go down a fifth, and the bass to go down by step, so from third inversion to first inversion. We then get D, A, G, and D. It's D minor in in root position this time. This G is a 4/3 suspension over the bass. And then we get C sharp, B flat, G, and E. This D is like a lower suspension. Maybe like what kind of suspension would this be? Maybe probably under the melody here, a 9/10 suspension. I've never been the best at lower suspensions, having to flip things around. Regardless, this C sharp diminished 7th chord is 7 of 4. Lots of focus on D minor in this chorale, but I don't think we've quite modulated. I think even though we have D minor, the dominant, and then D minor again, D, A, F, and D, it still sort of feels like we're just tonicizing D minor. It really doesn't matter what's before this, even though if the same chord is on either side of the dominant, kind of feels like for this moment we're in the key of D minor, even more so than if we just had the secondary dominant and the D minor chord. I don't know, I mean, it doesn't quite feel like we've modulated to me though, even though it looks like there's a modulation going on. This G sharp's little chromatic neighbor tone, or I guess it's our leading tone in the key of A minor. And then we get A, E, and C natural, which is our tonic, A minor. D sharp is a chromatic neighbor tone. We're tonicizing E here a little bit just with one note. And this half cadence is on E major, E, A, E, and B. This A is a 4/3 suspension over the bass. And then we go to E major, which is our 5 chord. The A resolves down the G sharp. Taking a moment to switch my pencil, we are still moving towards the key of A minor, but I believe Bach takes a brief reprieve to the key of C major for about half of the length of the phrase, starting things off with D, A, F, and D, which is kind of interesting here. I think what's going on is that this D minor chord, which is 4 in the key of A minor, is also 2 in the key of C major, but I think there's also an argument to be made that it might be 7/6 as well. Under different circumstances, or typically speaking, when we see two chords that could be inferred or interpreted as 7 chords, typically they're 7 chords because there's going to be a tonic on the other side, but because of the way that this progression is functioning, it really does feel like this B is just a passing tone rather than the root of the chord. But if you've watched some of my past videos, you'll hear me explain why I feel like this B is usually the root of the chord rather than this A, but here it just makes sense because I think like this 3-beat progression is actually just a greater 2/5 progression. Here we have A, C, E, and C. For the same reason, we could consider this a 6 chord, but I think this F sharp is the more likely root of this chord, or just the chord tone in general, and this would be F sharp diminished in first inversion, which is 7/6 of 5, because F sharp is the leading tone to G, and G is our 5. We then have G, D, G, and B. That is our 5 chord, so it does resolve where we would expect. Passing 7th on the bass, it's F natural this time versus the F sharp that led into the chord. And then we get E, E, G, and C, which is our tonic triad in first inversion, 1/6. We're looking for a point to modulate back to the key of A minor, and I think it's on the next beat. I suppose really any of these chords could have been a point to modulate back to the key of A minor, because pretty much all the key chords in the key of C major are diatonic to the key of A minor as well. But here we have E, D, G, and B. A bit of a passing E minor 7 chord. I don't think it's contributing too much, though. I feel like this chord is more so incidental than contribution to the chord progression. 1 is going to go to 4, F, C, F, and A, which is F major. And I think that this is our gateway back to the key of A minor. F major is now our 6 chord. We also have a passing 7th on the bass before we get another one of these C sharp diminished 7th chords. This D is an accented non-chord tone, C sharp, B flat, E, and G, which, as we learned from the previous phrase, is 7/7 of 4. And then it takes us to where we would expect, to 4. Or, I guess really depending on how you look at it, it could potentially be a 2 chord as well, and we have this sort of interesting deceptive split, but I feel like D, A, E, and F with this 9/8 suspension over the bass is implying 4, but this B does get introduced here, which could have the potential to turn this into a 2/6/5 chord, which, taking a fully diminished 7th and resolving it to another diminished chord, that is pretty fascinating. But I feel like this B, as I've said before in Bach's chorales, he tends to get the most contrapuntal texturally near the cadences, which makes picking out chords somewhat difficult. And this situation, it really does feel like we are resolving to D minor, just the B gets introduced here and confuses things. But because of the syncopation that's going on here in the tenor, it's hard to pick out exactly what's going on. But regardless, the C is also a passing 7th, and our half cadence at the end of the phrase ends on E major, E, G sharp, B, and E. We're also ending on a half cadence where the root of the chord is in the melody, which is pretty interesting. It's not, super fascinating or anything, but most half cadences have the 5th of the chord in the melody in the Bach chorales. Okay, looking ahead, we have another half cadence. This time, more specifically, it is a Phrygian half cadence in the key of A minor. And just like the previous phrase, I do believe we start in the key of C major, and we move to the key of A minor by the end. This time we have this juxtaposition of E major against E minor here, so this feels like a direct modulation. Even though we saw a minor dominant earlier in the chorale, I think that it feels like there is a stark juxtaposition here. There's a contrast between the E major from A minor and the E minor from C major. And then we also have a passing 7th here in the alto before we go to A, C, and F. That is F major over A, which is 4/6. Then we have some non-chord tones on the offbeat, B, G, D, and F. That's G7 over B, or 5/6/5. This 4/5/6/5 pattern is something that Bach does from time to time. It's a regular progression we see. It's also, in this situation, it happens to be adjacent harmony, 3/4/5, and that actually continues, C, G, D, and E. It looks almost as if we are going to get a tonic triad here in first inversion, but what actually ends up happening is this A gets introduced in the tenor, which turns this into a 6/6 chord, A minor over C. So the adjacent pattern continues, even though for all intents and purposes this A minor chord feels like a tonic triad. But after 6, Bach turns this into a falling fifths progression, C, F, A, and D, which is D minor over C. It's 2/4/2, and as we know about 4/2 chords, they tend to resolve down a step in the bass, and their roots are a fifth apart, so we would expect this to go to 5/6, which it does. B, F, G, and D. I'm going to use another arrow here because it's going to get kind of hectic. More specifically 5/6/5, but a 5/6 chord nonetheless. And then we resolve to C major, C, E, G, and E, which is our tonic triad. And coincidentally, oh, I see where a problem is here. I'm going to go ahead and erase this real quick. I'm going to first make sure that we go to the key of A minor first, and this is our 3 chord. I'm going to point this arrow off a little bit to the side, just say 5/6/5 here. That does the job just fine. After our 3 chord, we get some non-chord tones, a chromatic passage here in the alto, and some passing tones in the... Actually, they're all passing tones. One of them is chromatic passing tone, and the other 2 are not chromatic. We have B, E, G sharp, and D, which is E7 over B. That is 5/4/3. We've seen 3 to 5/4/3 in the past as well. This is not I wouldn't go as far to say that this is a normative progression, but it's not unprecedented. Maybe it is a normative progression because I do recall this progression being used in the past. All in all, I have seen it before, 3 to 5/4/3 specifically, and I think it has to do with the passing in the bass because C going down to B, B is C's passing 7th, and B also happens to be the 5th of an E chord, so yes, we've seen it in the past. But the 5/4/3 does resolve to A minor, A, E, A, and C. It's our tonic triad, passing 7th in the bass, anticipation in the melody. We then have F, A, and D. That is D minor over F, which is 4/6. And this B, again, getting introduced to sort of confuse the texture a bit. I suppose you could interpret this as a 2/6/5. We're going to say that that's a non-chord tone. And this C right here, this leaves us with a bit of an interesting situation. I feel like this A going down to G sharp is like what would that be? A 11/10 suspension, or a 4/3 suspension over the bass, and I guess another, wait, no, am I crazy? Yeah, like a 6/5 suspension in the tenor. So I feel, the alto. I feel like this is a 5 chord, but if you look at what's happening on the beat, E, A, C, and E, you could also analyze this as a 1/6/4 going to a 5. But to me, it really feels more so like the chord, this really does just feel like a double suspension to me, which, to be fair, 1/6/4 going to 5 really is just a double suspension because they both share the same root. And it's just the 2 voices moving down by step to resolve to the 5 chord. But over the short time frame here, the fact that it's happening over 8th notes just makes this feel like 4/6 going to 5 is the appropriate call here. All in all, there are multiple ways to interpret this, and I'm not one to say that it is conclusively one over the other. This is just the way that I'm choosing to analyze it. But on the next beat, we have another potentially Phrygian half cadence. It's definitely a half cadence, but whether or not it's Phrygian, I will leave it up to you. But we stay in A minor for the entirety of the section. We start off with another E major chord, E, G sharp, E, and B. And that takes us to A minor, A, E, and C. 1 chord. A little brief passing tone here in the bass. The C is a chord tone. This A is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get A, C, G, and B. I reckon actually what's happening here is the C is an accented non-chord tone, as well as this G. This B by virtue of the fact that it's a chord tone of what's happening on the next beat is part of the chord, but it's sort of functioning as an accented non-chord tone as well, because it's, or just an accented tone that we don't know is going to belong to the next chord because it happens before it, but because it happens to the chord that happens after it, or it belongs to the chord that happens after it, we're not going to mark it with any parentheses. But what goes here is B, D, F, and A, which is B minor 7 flat 5, which is not 7/7, it is 2/7. Kind of interestingly, this 2/7 chord goes not to 5 but to 3, so it's almost functioning like 7 of 3, C, E, E, and G, just by nature of the fact that 2 and 3 are adjacent to one another in the scale. It sort of feels like one is tonicizing the other, but in reality it's, I feel in this context, more so just an adjacent progression. Sort of in the same way that, well, in the major scale there's only one diminished chord and it's the 7 and it's tonicizing 1, but here it sort of feels like we're tonicizing 3. This E is a chord tone as well. We then get C, F sharp, D, and A, which is D7 over C, which is 4/4/2. And we know about 4/2 chords, as we've learned extensively from this chorale and also from my previous videos. It's going to resolve down by step. B, G sharp, D, and this B, they're all non-chord tones. B, G sharp, D, and B spells G sharp diminished chord in first inversion, resolves down a fifth into first inversion. So all the 4/2 chords are functioning like we would typically expect them to in this chorale. Next we resolve to 1, A, C, and C, 2 roots and 2/3, kind of an interesting spelling, but we do get the completed version of the chord on the end of the beat, so we don't need to mark this E nor this A. And then we get F, A, and D, which is 4/6, D minor over F. This D is a chord tone. This F is a chord tone, apologies. So it's kind of like taking the chord and putting it in root position. And this A is a 4/3 suspension over the bass, E, E, G sharp, and B, which is our 5 chord E major. Now the reason why I leave this Phrygian with a question mark at the end of it is because it really feels like this F is going down to E and this D is more ornamental than anything else. But if you're a literalist, you see F, D, E, and a Phrygian half cadence has the half step before the bass. If you feel like this D going to the E overrides the function that this F has in the greater analysis of what type of cadence is going on, then it's not a Phrygian half cadence. But if you look at the total gesture and look at this D as sort of part of an enclosure surrounding this E, then I would say that this is a Phrygian cadence. I feel like it's a Phrygian cadence, but I'll leave that up to you to decide because it's not too important. Alright, next phrase, we finally get a phrase that ends in a key other than A minor. We're going to end in D minor here. In fact, we don't spend any time in this phrase in the key of A minor in the way that I've analyzed it. This is another half cadence though. You might be seeing a theme here with a lot of half cadences. But we're going to start off in the key of G major with another direct modulation here with this, in this case, a juxtaposition of G natural against G sharp, but not in an E minor chord, in a C major chord. So we're seeing some type of similarity between the beginning of the B section and the beginning of this phrase as well, but here we're going to G rather than C. So this is our 4 chord, C major, and then we get some passing, or a passing tone in the tenor, and a neighbor tone in the alto. And I'll use an arrow here just so that I can move it out of the line. Here we have F sharp minor 7 flat 5 over C. The inversion doesn't really matter too much with these passing chords, but it is a passing 7th chord. 4 going to 7 is one of the most common, if not the most common, subdivided chord progression in all of the chorales. And then we have G, B, G, and D. This is our tonic triad, root position, passing tones in the upper voice, or sorry, not in the upper voices, in the tenor and the melody. And then we get G again, G, D, G, and B, which is our tonic triad. Passing tones in the outer voices this time, before we get B, D, G, and D, which is our tonic triad again, this time in first inversion. And this is where the phrase starts to get weird and also foreshadows what's going to be happening, not in our next phrase, but in the phrase afterwards. We're actually getting what I am analyzing as a distant modulation here, where this 4 chord is actually hinting at either some modality or some incomplete melodic minor. We're moving to the key of D minor here, and this G major I have analyzed as 4-6 because with this F natural here, it happens over a D minor chord rather than a G7 chord. We would expect G7 to resolve to some type of C major chord, but he turns it around on us and puts a D in the bass and doubles it. So it's interesting to hear G major go to D minor. I'm trying to think. The only other key that has that in common would be C major, but this is, in my opinion, this sounds undeniably G major based on what's happening in the bass here. I know that we start on a C major chord, but we go to G, and then we have this fragment here of G major going from 1 to 5, but the 5 gets turned into a minor chord, so it's a bit of a pivot and gives us this sort of D Dorian sound, like I was mentioning, C major being the only pitch collection that has D minor and G major in it without making alterations, but it really does feel like we're moving from G major to D minor here, especially with the more tonal approach to D minor that happens after the fact. So after our tonic triad, we get D, E, and G. This D is a lower suspension. This is actually C sharp, A, E, and G, which is A7 over C sharp. That's 5, 6, 5. And that takes us to D minor, D, A, E, and F. Typical Bach to have a 9/8 suspension over the bass, especially over a D minor chord. It's a special thing that Bach does a lot with D minor chords, I've been noticing. And then we cadence on A major, A, D, and E. This D is a 4/3 suspension over the bass. You notice that Bach has been doing this sort of prolonged suspension in pretty much all of the phrases so far, except for the end of the A section. But this A major chord is our 5 chord. Okay, moving into the next phrase. We're going to be moving back towards the key of A minor. We end this time in the only non-half cadence so far with a deceptive cadence, and we're going to be starting in the key of C major. Now you could analyze this as a direct modulation from D minor to C major, but I feel like this actually is connected and we have an interesting thing going on here. So this definitely harkens back to the second phrase. This D minor chord is our 1 in the key of D minor. In the key of C major, or sorry, D, F, A, and D. In the key of C major, it is our 2 chord, but I feel like this B natural also has a role here. So instead of 2, I feel like this 2 is sort of being repurposed as 7/6. The reason why has to do with the fact that sometimes Bach plays with us. You know, we do see these sort of passing 2 to 7 progressions, but I feel like in the grand scheme of things, it's really not a progression that's happening because it's just one voice moving. I feel like in order for a chord progression to occur, and this is based on my relationship with the harmony and analysis, it doesn't have to reflect yours, but if only one voice moves, it's harder to make the argument that an entire chord progression is happening. It's just the chord is sort of flipping or changing context. So I feel like the chord can coexist both as D minor as a means of modulating to the key of, or as a means of, resolving this half cadence to a tonic functioning triad, and it could also coexist as our diminished chord moving to the key of C. Or it can be our 2 chord, or it can be 2 going to 7. There are lots of different ways to interpret this chord progression. I feel like Bach plays with the idea of 2 being 7 and vice versa all the time. In his chorales, it's just something that is pretty, it's pretty much just baked into the nature of the 2 and the 7 chord and how they're related to one another. Just chords that are a third apart. They're the same chord, just one of the voices has to be moved by step to change it from one to the other. So that's, I think, what's happening here. So D minor is also sort of functioning as B diminished here. That's really all there is to it. We get C major on the other side though, C, E, C, and G, which is our tonic triad. We have a passing tone here in the bass before we get A, E, C, and A. There's an argument to be made that this is a 6th chord, but I feel like very similarly to what happened here in the second phrase, right? Because we're seeing kind of the flip side of what's happening here, where we have 2 going to 5, we have 7 going to 1. So Bach is flipping the script in terms of, how we're viewing this D minor chord. And I feel like there is some intention with that. But instead of 6, I feel like this is F sharp, A, C, and A, which would be 7, 6 of 5. So we're seeing the same chord from the second phrase here. These phrases are very similar. It's just interesting how Bach gets into the key. We don't see the tonic until later into the phrase in this chorale, and here we see pretty much an immediate resolution to the tonic in this phrase, and they're very similar to one another harmonically. They have very similar contours and profiles, but they're slightly different in terms of the way that, well, at least I interpret them, and I think that there are some slight changes on the impact that it has on the sound. So we have an interesting progression happening after this 7-6 of 5. It takes us not to not to G major, it takes us to E minor, E, G, B, and B. And this is a pretty interesting progression for a couple of reasons. One, this F sharp diminished chord, it's sort of like a secondary deceptive progression, because we would expect F sharp diminished to resolve to G major, but when it resolves to E minor, that's the equivalent of resolving to 6 in the key of G major. So this is a roundabout way of, I guess, describing a deceptive progression in the key of G major. So this is a secondary deceptive progression, but not from 5 going to 6, but from 7 going to 6, and that's far less common than 5 going to 6. But what's also interesting is the fact that E minor and C major are so close to one another, and I do believe the modulation to A minor is happening somewhere over this beat. This E might be a chord tone, but this C is a passing tone in the melody as well. And I do believe that this is where we're modulating to the key of A minor. So we have this 1-6 chord happening here, or maybe this 3 and 1-6 are sort of coexisting in the same way that this 7 and this 2 are coexisting. But I feel like we are also modulating to the key of A minor over this 3-6 chord. And it really does feel like 7-6 of 5 here is resolving to an E minor chord, and by the time we're at the end of the E minor chord, it's just aligning with the key of A. The analysis does look a little bit clunky, but I think it accurately depicts the fact that there is sort of a morphing of ideas going on here, a chord that is like almost duplicitous, where it has one function on one side and another function on the other side, and that's what really makes these single note chords difficult. And really, effectively speaking, only one voice is being moved here, because we're just getting a redundant E in the alto, and C is the only new note that's being introduced into the texture, realistically speaking, when we're talking about function. But after this point, I'm fairly certain that we're in the key of A minor. Of course, you could also just say that this 3 is our minor dominant in the key of A minor as well, but I think it's a little less likely. It doesn't quite feel that way. It feels like these are two sort of separate ideas that are being fused together. It doesn't really feel like the E minor is what's making the impact here. It really feels like the C major is making the impact in my ear. But then again, that's just my relationship with the harmony. You might analyze it differently. But afterwards, we get F sharp, A, D, and D. This is 4-6, D major over F sharp. We're harmonizing the melodic minor scale here, so we get major 4 chords and diminished 6 chords and minor 2 chords, etc. We have some passing tones as well. We have G sharp, B. This E is an anticipation, and with this D, that gives us E7 over G sharp, which is 5-6-5, and then we get A minor, A, C, E, and C, our tonic triad. C, E, A, and C also gives us sort of an A minor in first inversion without needing to mark any non-chord tones. He just reinverts the chord. And then we get D, F, A, and B, which is B minor 7 flat 5 over D. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. And then we get E, E, and G sharp all happening off of the harmonic rhythm with that B. That gives us a 5 chord. And then our deceptive cadence does not end on A minor, it ends on F major, which is our 6 chord, F, C, A, and A, which is pretty neat. Okay, looking to the end of the chorale, I was saving this tidbit for last because if you are following along in time and haven't analyzed on your own, there's a half cadence at the end here, which is pretty interesting. It's always interesting when Bach does not end with a perfect authentic cadence, but we spent the entire chorale without seeing a single authentic cadence. Now this might be a first. I don't think we've seen one in the past that has not had at least one perfect authentic cadence. It's really interesting that all of them are half cadences, or, well, we do have one deceptive cadence here, but all of them for the most part are half cadences. But as I mentioned in the previous phrase, we have G major going to D minor here, and that's what I feel exactly is going on here. We have this move to G major that in this case is very, very brief. We don't develop G major for very long, and then we immediately pivot to D minor, pretty much over the same chord progression. Not exactly, but pretty much the same. So we start off with F major going to E, E, G, and C in the key of A minor. That is our 3 chord in first inversion, C major over E. And that takes us to the key of G major, where it is now our 4 chord. Of course, you could also analyze this as a direct modulation. I feel like they're connected. Nothing about F major going to C major really feels like we're in the key of G major yet, but once we hear the F sharp afterwards, that's when it starts to feel more G major-like to me. But this F sharp as a passing tone and this A as a passing tone feels significant. That gives us F sharp, E, A, and C, which is F sharp minor 7 flat 5. That's 7 7 in the key of G. Again, 4 going to 7, very common subdivided chord progression in Bach. Very similar to the way we enter to the key of G as well. And then we get G, D, B, and B. And unlike the what am I saying? I just lost my train of thought. Actually, very similarly to the modulation, we spend more time developing G major here, where we get G major repeated 3 times. Bach does not do that. We immediately get the C sharp to D over the F. So we get this resolution not to the dominant, but to a D minor chord, which creates this really harsh juxtaposition of keys that are butting up against one another that use a chromatic chord to bind them. So this G major chord is also our 4 chord in the key of D minor, and this was how we modulated a D minor before. G is the common chord, as a chord tone here, so we don't need to mark it. Apologies. And then we get G, C sharp, E, and A, which is A7 over G. That's 5 4 2. We know what we would expect that to resolve to D minor in first inversion. This F is a non-chord tone, this F is a non-chord tone, this D is a non-chord tone, and when put together with this A, this gives us D minor in first inversion, so the 4-2 chord still does resolve, and this is where the chord progression starts to get really interesting, and we get some going off of the rails here a little bit. E, E, B, and G. Now, I think, if we look at the B here, the B really isn't functioning in the context of what is it called? The melodic minor scale. We would expect B to go to C sharp to go to D, but here we just see B skipping right to D, and it just is a very strange sound and a very interesting context to see a B natural in an otherwise D minor world, which sort of actually adds on to the little theory that I have that we're sort of in D Dorian, not in D minor. It sort of derails that theory because of the fact that he's using both at the same time, and we see more of a contribution from the tonal devices than we do from the modal devices, but the influence is still there nonetheless. So we're going to call this E minor chord 2, and remember it is a minor chord, so no diminished symbol. And then we have D, which is a non-chord tone, B, which is a chord tone, D, and F. And this sort of tacks on to the melodic minor theory, because in a roundabout way, we still are dealing with melodic minor, just the B moves over to the tenor, the same B that the alto is singing, I believe. And this gives us, I'm going to use the arrow again. I know the arrows are getting kind of out of control, but try your best to follow along with them. We have B diminished over D, which would be 6, 6 in the key of D minor. So a transitive progression, we would expect 6 to go to 2, but afterwards we see the context in which 6 is being used. It's actually kind of interesting how 6 diminished is being used, because in the same way that we saw 2, 7 go to 3, here we're seeing 6 actually go to 7, which sort of feels like 7 is being tonicized, the same way that 3 is being tonicized by this chord here. We typically don't see a diminished 6 chord go to a subtonic 7th chord, but here we see it, C, C, G, and E, which is just our 7 chord in in root position. And then afterwards, this A is a non-chord tone, C is a chord tone, F is a non-chord tone, and F is a non-chord tone as well. And this just takes us right to a 3-6 chord, F major over A. So we, in a roundabout fashion, have a normative chord progression and some strange chords where 6 almost feels like it's tonicizing 7, because it is a it's just a diminished chord that is and that should actually be in first inversion as well. Let me go ahead and rewrite that. It's actually on another line, so it shouldn't be too hard to just refactor like that. It feels almost like it's tonicizing 7, then 7 just goes around to 3 and follows the cycle. But instead of following the cycle, which it could go to 6. It has a 6 in the bass here. It's going to go to 4, 6. B, D, F, and G, which is G7 over B. That's 4, 6, 5. C sharp is a passing tone. A is a non-chord tone, but it's an anticipation to the next beat, and E is an anticipation to the next beat. C sharp, A, E, and G is A7 over C sharp. That's 5, 6, 5. And then we have D, A, E, and F. Typical Bach fashion to sort of imply this tonic triad with the 9/8 suspension over the bass. But what's really interesting here is that he morphs the chord very drastically after the suspension. The E resolves down like we would expect, but the bass leaps down a tritone, which is really bizarre. So I do think this is the point we do modulate back to the key of A minor. D minor is our 4 chord. And that takes us to basically a chord progression that's normative in the key of A major. G sharp, B, D, and F. So this G sharp's a non-chord tone, this B is a non-chord tone, this D is our chord tone, and F is also a chord tone. So that would be 7, 7 in root position. G minor 7, flat 5. No, sorry, that's G fully diminished. That is not F sharp. That should just be 7, 7. No half diminished symbol. And that takes us to A minor, or some semblance of an A minor chord. This D is sort of like a 4/3 suspension over the bass. We know our tonic is being implied, even though it's gotten contrapuntal by this point. This B is a non-chord tone, this D is a non-chord tone, this D is a non-chord tone, and then we get C, A, E, and, C, A, C, and E, which is just taking our tonic triad and putting it in first inversion. And then finally we close out the chorale with a half cadence, which is really interesting. We have E, A, B, and E. This A is a 4/3 suspension over the bass, but we know that 5 is being implied here because that's ultimately what the A is going to resolve to, this G sharp. This F sharp is an enclosure around the G sharp. And then we finally cadence on E major, E, G sharp, B, and E, which is our dominant triad in the key of A minor, and that's going to be today's analysis. All in all, there's lots to take away from this chorale. We have a little detail here, which is a minor dominant through in the first phrase here. We have mid-phrase modulations abound. Here we have C major, here we also have C major, G major, C major, G major, D minor. We have 2 modulations here in the last phrase, which is very uncommon, but pretty much every phrase has a mid-phrase modulation except for the first phrase of the A section and the second phrase of the B section. Every other phrase has a mid-phrase modulation of some sort. Then there's this idea of 2 and 7 coexisting with one another. We see this in 2 locations here where 7 is, in my opinion, taking precedence over 2 in terms of being the chord on the strong beat, and we see the vice versa happening on the counterpart of a phrase happening in the A section here, where 2 sort of takes precedence over 7 because it feels like 2 is going to 5, but here it feels like 7 is going to 1. So the fact that they can coincide with one another is really fascinating, and I think that there is definitely more to look into there, because there are different contexts in which 7 feels more prevalent, and there are different contexts in which 2 feels more prevalent. You know, sometimes Bach tonicizes these chords. There's really no consistency to it, but Bach definitely plays with the idea of 2, which is a stable chord, and 7, which is an unstable chord, and them coexisting with one another. And of course, we have distant modulations. We have G major to D minor twice in this chorale, as well as, what was the last thing? Oh, yes, the secondary deceptive progression here, 7, 6 of 5 going to 3. It's pretty interesting when we see those in Bach. You know, I remember in the first video, I was pretty amazed by the fact that Bach started off with that, but of course I was looking at a later chorale. It wasn't chronological. Regardless, that was just something that I've been looking for in the chorales since then, because it was one of the early quirks that I happened to stumble upon. But that's going to be today's analysis. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.